Hello and welcome to our second event for Dantedì, which we're celebrating today on, of course, the occasion of the Supreme Poet Dante Alighieri's 700th anniversary and the day dedicated to him. We're going to be welcoming Professor Joseph Luzzi in just a moment, but before we take that deep dive into Dante, I'd like to invite you to pop any comments you'd like and questions into the chat, and we'll address them during the talk. And I'll also just share this link to you to the Florentine's Dante-inspired issue, which you can still purchase at this link here. And that will, of course, be available up until the end of the month, before our April issue will be out on the 1st of April. And another thing I'd just like to share before we start is this link to the events that are to mark Dantedì. And at this link, you can also find the links to the official 700 Dante website and the Regione Toscana's recently launched site, Dante al Tosco. And so with that, I'll bring on our guest for today's talk, which is Joseph Luzzi. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jane. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much.
I'll just introduce you, I suppose, to our viewers. You have received your PhD from Yale and are a professor of comparative literature and faculty member in Italian studies at Bard College. You have two books, My Two Italies, which was the New York Times Editor's Choice Selection, and I'll have the link appear here now. And then also In a Dark Wood, What Dante Taught Me About Grief, Healing, and the Mysteries of Love, declared by Vanity Fair magazine as a must-read selection and also translated into multiple languages. And here's that link. And so thank you so much for joining us on this very apt occasion to discuss Dante.
Thank you. I mean, I have to say, to me, this feels like a homecoming because I've spent so much time in Florence over the years, and most recently in 2017 when I was a fellow at Villa I Tatti, which was an incredible experience. And I actually got to have a great conversation with the Florentine editor, Helen Farrell, while I was here. So mi sento a casa, I feel at home whenever I have anything to do with Florence, and whenever I have anything to do with the Florentine, a paper that I've admired and watched grow over the years with great admiration. And, it's very meaningful to be here today on Dantedì because here we are, the 700th anniversary of Dante's journey to the Al di là, starting in Inferno. And I can't think of a more apt place for me personally to celebrate this. So thank you.
Not at all. And I just have to quickly correct myself. I said there that the Florentine Dante themes issue will only be available until our April issue, but that is not true. It will remain on our website. So I just have to quickly pop in that correction before I forget about it. Perhaps we could start our discussion then with some of your insights on why a work written 700 years ago still garners such an incredibly vast amount of interest. Have you any thoughts on why that is?
I think it's, it's the great question. I always tell my students, if you think back to when Dante wrote the Divine Comedy in the early 1300s, so much from that period is lost, right? So much would seem remote to us, alien, written in a different cultural idiom, not just a different language, but, a different culture, a different worldview. And yet, what is it about Dante's Divine Comedy when we read those opening lines? Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita mi ritrovai per una selva oscura. In the middle of our life's journey, I found myself in a dark wood. And I think that tension between the pronouns, Jane, this sense of nostra vita, our life, mi ritrovai, I found myself. And that's, that's that universal space of crisis, I think, that Dante articulates. That's why we're drawn to it, because unfortunately, all of us in our lives are, if not definitely, are at least likely to end up in our own version of the dark wood. So whether one is Christian, whether one accepts Dante's faith, and of course his faith underwrites the journey through the Divine Comedy, I think you can read it from so many different perspectives. And I think Dante's ongoing relevance rests on this capacity to create this empathetic space of common humanity from the opening lines of his poem.
Absolutely. And I wondered, is it more apt than ever to read the Divine Comedy in the middle of a pandemic and when we're all grappling with possibly our own thoughts during this extra time at home. We've more time to reflect on, as you see, personal crises perhaps, and our own journeys. And he does that so expertly, of course, bringing us through all the various themes of life. Not an easy endeavor, and of course that's why it takes so many cantica to get through all that, but then eventually we do emerge into a better afterlife. What about some of his themes then and key issues? Are there any of those themes that you think are particularly worthy of interest?
So I to your first point, I do think there's something about, I wrote a little piece for the National Italian American Federation on Dante and the pandemic, in which I reflected on just that. Why now may Dante resonate, especially as we live in times of social distancing, physical separation, as we see all the, the illness and death surrounding us. I think we're all in a form of collective mourning. I think that Dante definitely, we can relate to that because Dante writes about things that are so important to us in this time of pandemic, right? Think about Dante's theme of how we need leaders. Virgil, his leader, his guide. Then it's Beatrice, right? Dante can't make the journey alone. And we ourselves in this time have reached out for help and guidance. It could be a family member, it could be a public figure, it could be these frontline workers that have worked so heroically. We have seen how you can't get through a crisis on one's own. A second thing I think is that Dante, Dante writes about his great personal crisis, exile. And it was his personal crisis, but he somehow universalized it, right? So you don't have to have experienced crisis, the experience of exile literally to understand what Dante's going through. And I think that when we go through something like the pandemic, I remember when the news first broke where the situation was worse in Italy than it was in the United States at the beginning, I watched in horror and pain as, Florence, the city I loved, emptied of tourists, people at home, people stuck inside and not being able to circulate. And I thought, that's why we read great literature like Dante's, is it doesn't provide answers, but it helps us find the right questions in times of crisis. And I think that's why, the other thing I think is extraordinary when we read Dante, even if we're not connected physically to other readers, there is that virtual community of people reading Dante, right? And somehow we're all in it together. And I don't think it's a surprise that in some way reading has experienced a bit of a renaissance during the pandemic, because they have more time to reflect, yes, but they also want that kind of connection that reading brings. I created something called the Virtual Book Club, which I had been planning before based on a lot of the speaking that I do and a lot of the, the public events I do for general audiences. I thought, wouldn't it be great? Why should I travel, get on a plane when we can all just meet through the technology today? And lo and behold, in the pandemic, it seemed like the right time to sort of try something like this. And the response has been extraordinary. We're now over, 300 members in 6 countries. And it's been a wonderful international experience of people coming together to celebrate the written word. We read contemporary works, we read classic works. We started with The Great Gatsby. This month we're reading Ishiguro's new novel, Clara and the Sun. And it's been amazing. I think Dante understood this. Reading creates virtual communities at a time when you can't physically to be together. Because think about it, Dante, the last 20 years of his life was spent in exile, apart from the city he loved, his country. It wasn't just his city, it was his country. He was spaesato, he was without a home. And to me, that's the great theme of the Divine Comedy. When I wrote my book, In a Dark Wood, I had been a scholar of Dante, a teacher of Dante for decades. I had in my own life a difficult personal situation where my late wife passed away. She had a fatal car accident, and 45 minutes before she died, she gave birth to our daughter, who was rescued, miraculously. and lived. And there I was. I wasn't in the car. I left the house at 8:30 that morning to go teach. I found out, and by noon, I was a widower and a father. And
Oh,
that
right.
was a cataclysmic morning, as you can imagine.
Of course.
And Dante's voice spoke to me. And that's why I wrote the book, is that Dante's tragedy was losing. Yes, he lost Beatrice. She died when she was 24. But the Vita Nuova, his first autobiography, is more about the death of Beatrice. In the Divine Comedy, Beatrice comes his muse. And the loss, the gaping hole for Dante, I believe, is the loss of Firenze. That's what he carried with him. So whenever we go through something personally, like I went through, or collectively with the pandemic and COVID, I think that's when Dante's work carries a special resonance for readers.
It's true. And I think, maybe does it come across, do you feel that Dante might have a fear of loneliness as we go through that journey with him? I feel there might be points in the Divine Comedy where he's kind of clinging almost to Virgil, and then Beatrice is in, don't leave me here, of course, in Inferno, which is a natural reaction. But do you think that could be brought into a larger reflection on a human's fear of isolation, and of course our own forced isolation in this time? For many people, experiencing the pandemic alone was an incredibly difficult experience.
Absolutely. I think one of the things you just articulated is one of the, I think, the great misfortunes of literary history is that most people that read Dante read only Inferno. It's the most famous canticle. It's certainly the most dramatic, but it's really only 1/3 of the poem. And that's where you do get Dante at his most fearful. Dante is most hesitant. Dante is most uncertain. Remember in the beginning, Inferno 1, there's this constant refrain of paura, 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 fear. And so Dante has to educate himself out of that fear. And if you read Paradiso, it's not loneliness, it's not fear, it's plenitude, it's contemplation, it's joy. And most people, unfortunately, don't get there. But what I would say is, I think this is really an idea that I had when I wrote my book, In a Dark Wood. I used to think, my late wife's accident, what landed me in the dark wood would be what defined me for the rest of my life. Now I think it's following Dante. It's what you do to get out of the dark wood that defines you, right? Dante gets out of the dark wood, right? The poem starts there, but by the end of the poem, I don't want to give too much away because I do want everyone to read it. He has this it's one of the few epic poems that ends happily.
Right.
It ends with this extraordinary symphonic vision of God and the universe, l'amor che muove il sole e le altre stelle, the love that moves the heavens and all the other stars. Incredible line. And that you have to follow the journey to the end. And that, Dante, it's a long, long journey. Look, exile wasn't easy for Dante. You mentioned his loneliness. There's that amazing moment in Paradiso 25 where he says, "Se mai continga che il poema sacro," right? Should it ever come to pass that this sacred poem to which heaven and earth had both lent their hand, that it will overcome the cruelty that bars me from the fair sheepfold of Florence where I slept as a lamb. I'm paraphrasing, but you get the gist of it. Is he says, this poem has made me macro, lean, like hungry. The burden of writing the Divine Comedy, 14,233 lines.
Incredible.
In exile, it's a gift he left to humanity, but boy, it came at quite a cost. I don't think he would have written the Divine Comedy had he not been exiled. I'm not alone in thinking that.
I agree with
It,
you.
quite a cost, to say the least.
I think it's quite uplifting, really, to hear about how trudging into the worst of human experience and grappling with some of the most difficult things. I mean, we probably couldn't have imagined rather before we read the Divine Comedy. His fantasy and imagination is just, it's so awe-inspiring. But when we get out of that and out of the depths of despair and emerge into that light, and we were actually just discussing the divine light and the visual images.
Yes.
And created artistically then afterwards. But that's when you can feel, okay, we're out now, we're out, we've seen the stars again, we're back, we're stars. So I think maybe you could give us a little bit about the other side once you've come through those difficult moments.
You know, I don't think it's a coincidence. My next book is going to be on Botticelli's Lost Drawings of Dante. And a lot of it was inspired by times I've spent in Florence. I think to really understand Dante, you've got to walk through the streets of Florence to really see what he missed, where he lived, what he loved, the places that he saw. And, you know, Dante's poetry is so visual artists from Botticelli to Blake, to Doré, to, you know, Rauschenberg, so many, Dali, have just been enthralled by Dante's visual imagination. And I think part of it is because, you know, Dante has a task, a challenge. He needs to represent something that is beyond human rationality, right? It's one thing to be in hell and to see the visceral, dramatic pain and suffering. It's another thing to be in heaven where, you know, at one point he's told basically the divine spirit is condescending to give him something his senses can understand. Not condescending in a negative sense, literally coming down to human perception. So that's where poetry comes in. That's where poetry becomes a sort of translation of this ineffable experience into imagery, right? That is an approximation of the divine, not the actual thing, because that can't be recalled, that can't be recreated. But, you know, whether it's the light show or Beatrice's smile, all these things are signifiers of the surpassing beauty that Dante has to somehow find a poetic idiom for.
Yes. What have you taught the Divine Comedy as a literary work, or have your teachings taken other lenses?
Oh, no. Teaching Dante is my bread and butter. I teach Dante. I'm teaching a course now at Bard this semester. I'm always teaching Dante. I try to teach Dante pretty much every year. I do it for a couple of reasons. One, I think Dante is very hard to pick up. Like, you know, here's the Inferno translation by Robert Hollander and Gene Hollander. It's very hard to pick Dante up and read it. I've had so many people like racking their brain. Too many characters, too many issues, too much theology, too much doctrine. Dante is best studied. Dante is best learned communally. So I feel as a professor, as a teacher, it's important that this is one of the books that I really feel benefits from all work. But this one, there's almost a need for it to be in a classroom setting. And the second thing is, you know, I always find something new in Dante, always find something new. I've been teaching him now for 2 decades, reading him for 3. And, you know, there's this sense of, I can always find something new. And so you know, in Moby Dick, Ishmael says the whaleboat was my Harvard College and my Yale, something like that, Yale and Harvard. That's Dante feels like my university. I mean, I have studied him for so many years and I'm constantly learning. And I'm in awe of Dante's erudition, the level of knowledge. Think about it. He's got poetry, philosophy, history, antiquity, medieval culture, contemporary culture. It's just an extraordinary, as my advisor from graduate school, Giuseppe Mazzotta, used to call it, Dante's encyclopedic vision. You know, that's just so extraordinary. One can spend a lifetime studying Dante.
Undoubtedly. And maybe you could just give us a quick comment on Dante's own education then. As you've said, it was so vast and covered so many areas, but how was Dante educated?
So I'm not, you know, I'm not an expert on Dante's education. My understanding of it is that, you know, it's not that he went to university and took a college degree.
Right.
That was very rare back then. Yeah. Florence was incredibly cultured. You know, there was I believe there were the public debates between the Dominicans and the Franciscans that Dante writes about in Paradiso when he compares St. Francis and his order that takes the vow of poverty with the intellectual, you know, capaciousness and you know, ability to defeat heretics of the Dominicans, who are much more worldly. So these were all in the air. Florence was on its way to becoming the center of European humanism, that it would be after Dante left, of course, when the Renaissance blossomed. But a lot of the seeds were there. To me, to really understand Dante's education, I always recommend read the Vita Nuova. That's not a book that everyone has read. It's an extraordinary book. It's basically an anthology of the poetry that Dante wrote from the time he was a late teenager until his late 20s, early 30s. It's completed around 1295, when he would have been 30. And it's a sort of anthology with commentary on Dante's apprenticeship in the sweet new style, this remarkable poetic movement led by Dante's primo amico, best friend, Guido Cavalcanti, right? And Guido Guinizelli, and all the whole group. It's just, you get a sense of this flourishing literary culture. Medieval Florence and Renaissance Florence are very different. You know, if you walk around medieval Florence, you still see the buildings, those tall, skinny, they're almost like fortresses, right? And some of the families had their equivalent of like a private militia, right? There was so much strife between the families. The idea of the Renaissance Florence, of the big open sun-drenched piazzas filled with art, that comes later. Medieval Florence was a very different place, but already by Dante's time, it was becoming, there were wealthy families, you know, like Beatrice's family, the Portinari, who gave I believe the hospital Santa Maria Nuova, which is still, I believe it's still, you know, one of the main hospitals in Florence. Great donators to the city, bankers. There's a lot of wealth. The wool industry was thriving. You know, it was a proud republic. Dante was a prior, which was the highest elected official in Florence. So you're talking about an incredibly sophisticated city in the Middle Ages, even before it becomes, you know, the capital of the Renaissance unofficially. So, you know, learning was in the air. The study of the classics, the openness to foreign cultures, the sense of the volgare, a culture in the vernacular. That's Dante's goal in the Vita Nuova, to show that Tuscan could create just as extraordinary literary works as Latino. So that is all happening. And that's part of why, you know, exile is so painful for Dante, because his Florence is just, you know, blooming flower, as the name shows, Fiorenza, right? The blooming flower, the lily. This was a real cultural ferment, and to lose that was lacerating for Dante, and really put him into a tailspin for many years before he finally came to terms with it and began to write the Commedia years after.
Yes, absolutely. And I think what we might not have imagined we would ever have to face, for many people who are not able to visit Florence and share that passion for the city, they can probably understand Dante's yearning if they're tuning in from elsewhere, and a Florentine aficionado, and they can't come here just yet. I can assure that they're feeling that tug that he speaks about when he discusses his Firenze. And
Absolutely.
you know, he remains so tied to the city. And I think that's more than likely another reason for his popularity, is that Dante is still so present in Florence, and walking the streets of Florence, as you say, we see these tower houses, and yes, life is very easy to imagine as it was then. It isn't so removed to imagine him walking down the street and having these grand thoughts. It's such a visual experience to read the work and then walk the streets, and it adds so much to our understanding of his work also.
It really does. And, you know, one of the hard things with Dante is that his name is so famous. Dante, Shakespeare, you know, he's one of the most famous poets of all time, writers of all time. So he becomes what I call the statua, the statue, you know, Piazza Dante, Via Dante, Padre della Lingua Italiana. But you got to remember, Dante is at heart a radical experimental poet who took big risks. You know, I was asked recently, why is Beatrice so high up in heaven? Why does she get to talk to the Virgin Mary? I mean, like, because Dante wanted her to. I mean, you see all these Florentines in the afterworld. It's one thing to have Odysseus, you know, and all these other figures, but Ciacco the glutton in Dante's, you know, from Dante's Florence, all these figures that Dante reanimated in writing the Commedia, it's a lot to do with his personal idiosyncratic relation to Florence.
Yeah.
And I really do feel it's essential for me to get back to Florence to really feel Dante. I can read him, I can study him, I have my notes and whatnot, but to recharge the batteries, to feel the atmosphere, it's just I feel it viscerally, palpably,
I can imagine. And I think it is one consolation in the meantime, that so many Dante-themed events are available online at the very least in this year of Dante. So I think that's one consolation, and that will fill the gap until you can get back here.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the other thing I think about with Dante, he never got back to Florence. I mean, that's the amazing thing. He dies in exile, and that's part of the poem's heartbreak, if you will. The fact that I often think like the Tuscan language became a second home for Dante when his real home was gone, right? When he sees his ancestor Cacciaguida, and the prophecy of Dante's exiles announced. These are things that the poet knows because he's writing after his exile, and he has to the character has to learn, because the poem takes place in 1300 before the exile. But it's really this sense of expulsion from Florence is the beating heart of the poem, and that's why I think to be able to talk about it in the context of a newspaper magazine like the Florentine, which is dedicated to expatriate life, foreigners. Florence belongs to the world, right? People come to Florence from all over the world. And Dante's part of that Florentine cultural patrimony, for sure.
It's very true. Well, I'm interested to hear your opinion on the great debate that he's buried in Ravenna and was never returned to Florence and to be buried. And of course, you can tell us a little bit about what's in that place. What we have is the cenotaph in.
Yes.
What's your thought on that?
Okay, so I would refer everyone to my friend Guy Raffa's wonderful book, Dante's Bones, which is basically about that. The whole book. Guy wrote a wonderful book about the struggle for Dante's bones, that took place over centuries, and that Ravenna has them, Florence wants them, and they have wanted them. Lorenzo de' Medici wanted them. This goes back centuries, okay?
Yes.
You have to, what always amazes me about this is that Florence exiles Dante. I don't think the ban to revoke Dante was officially revoked until centuries later, so this sort of they exile him, and now they want his body back. But remember, Dante did not write the Divine Comedy in Florence. So in a sense, the Divine Comedy belongs to all of Italy, right? Not just Florence, because it was a map of Dante's itinerary in exile is like a map of medieval Florence. So it transcends Florence in the sense that it was a lot of it was written in Verona, a lot of it was written in Ravenna. Those are the two places where Dante had the greatest sort of peace in exile. Yes. What amazes me, though, and this is now I'm speaking personally, is that that monument to Dante in Santa Croce is so powerful. It's not a real grave, right? But it was built in 1865 to mark the 600th anniversary of Dante's birth. So 100 years, I'm sorry. Dante was born in 1265. That statue was erected, I believe, 1865, when Florence became capitale, right? And there was a big ceremony in Santa Croce. And, a poet that I've worked quite a bit on, Ugo Foscolo, writes about Santa Croce as the temple of Italian glory, when Italy lacked a homeland. He writes in Dei Sepolcri, a beautiful poem from 1807 on sepulchres, that you have in Santa Croce, you have Michelangelo, Machiavelli, Galileo, Rossini, Alfieri. They're all buried there. These great Italian spirits. Dante's not, but his ghost seems to inhabit Santa Croce. You can't spend time in Florence, and that looming statue, it's like the biggest statue of all, 19 feet high. It seems to me, it's almost fitting that it's his spirit rather than his body, you know, like, because his spirit is so alive in the city. And I think, though he's technically not buried in Florence, one feels Dante's spirit around that statue. I do, and I always have. From my first time I came to Florence when I was an undergrad, decades ago, I still remember sitting in Santa Croce under that statue and thinking, wow, you know, Dante's, questa è la piazza di Dante, you know, this is almost, he's not in Santa Croce, but he might as well be, because he's so essential to the program of Santa Croce, of being this sort of Italian pantheon, right?
Absolutely. You know? It certainly is the most one. You can't say the most, but it is such a commanding presence in Santa Croce. And certainly when I visited there, it had the largest crowd outside. And I think there's the attraction of the drama around it too. And now I'm happy to be corrected about this, but I think I came across an article only recently that it wasn't revoked, was it? That he was exiled, and that there's still people arguing for that, but that's not something I have the up to the minute knowledge on, so I'm happy to be corrected there.
Well, my understanding, and again, I don't have the material in front of me, my understanding was that the city council revoked it in 2008 by a vote 19-5, 706 years later. That's, again, I'm speaking from memoria, that I don't have the facts and figures, and I don't recall exactly the source, but that's at least my understanding. But I'm open to someone finding the fact and either proving that or showing otherwise. But the bottom line is, whether it's still open or if it was recently revoked, you know, I understand that's still a long time, right?
Yes, absolutely. I'm just quickly going to invite our viewers. I can see we still have eyes on us, so do pop in any questions. We have this Dante chat, and I think the fact as well that we can have a little mention about your book, In a Dark Wood, and what Dante taught me about grief and healing. We did discuss that there briefly, but I wondered, is there anything else that you'd like to mention about that?
So, you know, the book, my most direct engagement with Dante was In a Dark Wood, what Dante taught me about grief, healing, and the mysteries of love, which I wrote, was published in 2015. And it shows how, after the death of my late wife, Catherine, that Dante's message, Dante's poetry, Dante's experience of exile really became an integral part of helping me get back on my feet, helping me rejoin the living after that. And, you know, I always thought I would write a scholarly, I have written scholarly things on Dante. I assumed my book on Dante would be a work of scholarship, more academic. But after that happened, and the directness and immediacy with which I heard Dante's voice made it necessary for me to write an extremely personal book. That, you know, My Two Italies was a memoir about my family's journey from Calabria to the United States. My parents were born in Calabria, my older siblings. I was born in the United States. And then I went back to Italy to study, to Florence. And so I talk about the two Italies, Italy and Italian America. I talk about Calabria in Florence. I talk about the collision of these different versions of Italy in my life, hence the title, The Two Italies. And those books I had written 2 academic books before that. These were much more personal memoir and drawing on my training as a scholar and my background, but writing in a way that would be accessible to any reader with no specialized background.
And that leads very nicely into a question that just came in. Yes. Accessibility. Someone has asked, how does Dante resonate with young students? And of course, it isn't a very accessible book. So how can you make younger students get something from reading this?
Thank you for that, Nancy. It's a great question. Here's the amazing thing. The college I teach at has an early high school, a high school early college program, and I've lectured there on Dante several times. They love it.
Really?
Young students love Dante. They get into Dante. You got to know how to pitch it, right? Dante's love for Beatrice, Dante's exile, the drama of him, you know, his experience of all the political corruption in Florence. They really do love this. Of course, some of the more doctrinal things are hard for any reader, right? Not just younger people, but a lot of the theology loses people. Some people get stumped by the intensely Christian nature of it. Others are drawn to the intensely Christian nature of it. But for young people, I think you have to sort of distill those elements of Dante that anyone can relate to. And everyone can relate to falling in love, losing a place that you love, experiencing ostracism, experiencing exile, maybe not exile, but, you know, the sense of expulsion. All of these things are just so instantly accessible to my younger students. I teach undergraduates, and I'm always amazed by how quickly they enter Dante's world. You know, very little, as long as it's sort of, you know, you have to meet every reader on his or her their turf, right? And I don't, you know, I tend to assign less secondary literature and just have them read the poem. Just read it. And if you don't understand something, we talk about in class, you know. So it's not easy. It's not easy. And what I do is, so less is more. I don't assign a ton of reading, just a few canti at a time, because if it's too much, it becomes character, you know, it becomes a blur, right? So small, and I focus on those dramatic episodes. So we can't do all cantos. There's 100 of them. So we'll focus on Paolo and Francesca, Brunetto Latini, Pier delle Vigne, Ulisse, Ugolino, right? These real moments of great drama. And we'll go deep on them. So that's my tactic. Thank you for that question.
I've seen a few, some of them actually very recently published books for even younger, again, children. I think even Disney has one. So I think it's amazing too that there's this desire to let even early readers in on the surprises and joys to be found in Dante. And of course, heaven and hell are, I mean, I can imagine the concepts for kids as well that are quite easy, good, bad.
Right. Yeah. And I also think that's a way what draws the modern reader to Dante is that, you know, as much as we find some of it cruel, as much as we find some of it judgmental, Dante's moral universe, you know where you stand, right? Inferno, Purgatory, Paradiso. There's those, as you said, the distinctions are so dramatic that it's quick to you can get your bearings rather quickly on it, right? It's not the realm of ambiguity, that's for sure.
And another question I have, and perhaps the last one, unless we have any more coming in the meantime, but I'm interested to know what surprises readers the most in their reading of Dante. Do you find that there's a common wow moment or a common question that comes out from, I mean, very generalized question there, but I'm intrigued to find what stands out for the majority of readers.
I think what surprises readers the most is the transition out of hell. Hell is so famous. The characters are so ingrained in cultural memory, as they were over centuries, right? That, you know, even people, Paolo and Francesca have been famous for centuries. Even when Dante during the Enlightenment wasn't read that much. Voltaire said famously, no one reads Dante anymore because the Enlightenment culture didn't have much time for Dante's mysticism, his intense religiosity. It was a more rational period. But even then, Paolo and Francesca, Ulysses, these are very famous canticles. So people have this image of Dante as judgmental, severe, harsh, and then they read him in heaven and the joy, the singing, the dancing, the sense of peace, bliss, contemplation. That really floors readers. That transition to joy, that transition to hope and happiness really, really surprises a lot of readers who just did not think it would be there. I would say that more than, and I think that's why we need to read Dante all the way through.
That's it. And I think that's actually a lovely note to end on, is to emerge into that joy and light and conclude our discussion there. And thank you so much for your time. It was very interesting to hear your thoughts on Dante and to have an exploration of aspects people mightn't have considered as well. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Jane. This was a great pleasure. Thank you to everybody.
Thank you to everyone who's tuned in as well. And I'll just quickly let you know that you can find the rest of our TF Together sessions at the link below. Our next one will be on the 2nd of April, and it's keeping with an Italian language focus. We'll have Professor Herman Haller discussing the Accademia della Crusca. So that'll be another one to tune in if you've been interested in today's talk. So thank you so much again. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.